What more? Right here.
I was wondering if you would have a conversation with us about brain function as it relates to maybe Alzheimer's and the condition of ADHD, hyperactivity, perhaps some cures that can happen. Is there a way through neurological training that Alzheimer's can be reversed?
Well, yes. It is not necessary that it come through something outside of you, because perhaps a good place for us to begin is by talking about what it is. It is a unconscious withdrawal in a unconscious attempt to restore well-being. So it is usually a highly sensitive being who has strong wanting, so lots of non-physical energy has been flowing, that has been thwarted by conditions that make it seem impossible to achieve balance. And so it is an unconscious attempt at slowing down the energy in order to achieve some sense of stability.
What causes it? I know they say there's tangles in the brain and all that kind of thing. Is it nutritive? Are there any nutritive things that can help? Can we physically create new pathways in the brain to bypass those tangles through neurological exercises, through training?
It is possible, and we believe that, as with all things like that, the more exposure and the more experimentation, then the more solutions come forth. But we're not great advocates of looking for something outside of self, because it can take decades to bring that about. The tricky thing about something like this is that it did not come about all at once. It is a gradual thing that has come about as a result of the mix of energies within the individual. Truly, that's what it is. It is the ratio between desire and belief that is at the heart of everything like that. So then, after unconsciously holding yourself in vibrational resistance and not allowing the energy to flow, something manifests, then at that point it is usually a more difficult thing to turn around. Give us some details about your interest here.
We think that my mother, who's just turned 80, is developing Alzheimer's. We haven't had her in for the CAT scan tests or the MRIs or anything, but she continually asks the same question. She is perfectly happy. I mean, she knows that there's something going on. She does not initiate conversations anymore, but she, remembers and will step in and talk about things. But it's hard on my dad. It's hard on us too, because of course we're projecting our fear into the future. And so we're projecting our fear of what's going to happen next. How do we support Mom? How do we support Dad?
Anytime something is given a label, there is added expectation about the results that you are not wanting. And so if we had an influential position with anyone, we would back far away from the label. Because what happens is, once others begin to put a spotlight on a specific label, almost always the symptoms become more. Are you not noticing that already? And so we would begin saying things like, well, we all do some of that, because it is all about consciousness or about focus, you see. Last evening, Jerry and Esther went next door to have a bite to eat. And a very sweet little lady met them at the door. And they said they would like to have a bite to eat. And Esther said, it would be really lovely if we could sit in a booth. And she said, oh, would you like to be put on the waiting list for a booth? And Esther looked over and she could see that there was a booth that was empty and another one about to be. And Esther said, well, no, we really don't want to wait. We'll just sit at a table. And so they sat at the table and ordered their food. And then in a few minutes, another couple came in, and Esther heard them say, "We would like to sit at a booth," and she escorted them to the booth. And Esther is thinking, did I miss something here?
Yeah.
And so, in time, the woman came back round, and Jerry was visiting with her, and he said, "We're just curious about why you did not seat us at the booth." And she said, "Well, you said you did not want to be put on the waiting list for the booth." And Jerry said, "Well, that was true. We did not want to be on the waiting list for the booth. We were wondering why you seated those people in the booth." The woman said, "Well, because they asked to sit in the booth." And Jerry said, "But we asked to sit in the booth." And she said, "But you weren't on the waiting list." And Jerry said, "But they weren't on the waiting list either." And she said, "But they asked to sit in the booth." And Esther said, "We're in the twilight zone."
Yes.
Now what we're getting at here is there was some miscommunication that started way back there somewhere, and we're certain that there was logic to what this woman was offering, although no one else could figure out what it was. There are all kinds of different ways at looking at all kinds of things, and there is a tendency to want everyone to see everything in exactly the same way. And Esther said to Jerry, "I was surprised that you were willing to take this further." And Jerry said, "I was just really curious." He said, "I feel much better now that I know that it was a communication thing. She was not being deliberately rude or deliberately uncaring or deliberately unfair. It was more about an opportunity to have this conversation than anything else. It defied logic of others that were looking on, but it was perfectly logical to this woman." Mm-hmm. We would not encourage Jerry and Esther to try to show her the error of her way. We would not even say that they were right and she was wrong. If we were interacting with someone who was seeing things differently than we would call it a quirk. We would call it just the way they are. We would look for evidence that it has been present within their experience before. We would acknowledge that those kinds of things are in all of our experiences. How often do you speak with someone who's sitting right in the room and they don't even hear anything that you say? And then a minute or two later they respond to it. It's all about consciousness and projection of consciousness. That's what everything is, you see. And this disease that is becoming more and more in every day, they are assigning this label to more and more people, is happening now at this time in a more rampant manner because the energies of your planet are moving faster, which means it's sort of like if you live in an area and there is one booming radio station, it may even bleed through on all of your stations that are close by. Or as there are more and more and more and more radio stations, you have to be more discriminating about where you set your dial. And that's sort of what's happening in your environment, in your mental environment, in your electronic environment. There is so much more that is being transmitted. You are being bombarded by so many transmissions, and we're not just talking about cell phones and microwaves. We're talking about the thought transmissions from so many of you. And so it becomes more and more valuable for any of you to find your center. And those who are sort of on the edge of not finding their center are having more and more of these kinds of experiences.
Would this relate also to the brain function of so many children are being labeled with ADHD and being put on Ritalin?
That is the reason. It is the same thing. There's more stimulation of thought and more confusion about focus. I want to give you something here because some of you have heard us offer this analogy, but we're going to put it into a light that's going to be extremely helpful for you here relative to this. So here you are. For whatever reason, what you've been focusing upon has caused you to begin emitting a set of vibrations, which are your desires and beliefs, the combination of those. And let's say something has happened and you find yourself really feeling uncomfortable. You're really in an angry, uncomfortable mode. And your range of vibration is angry to angry to angry. In other words, you're really angry and you're a little less angry and you're a little less angry, but that's your range. You're angry. So you reach for the best feeling thought that you can find, and as you hold that thought for as little as 17 seconds, that best feeling thought in that angry range becomes your center point, and now the really angry thought is out of range, and an even less angry thought comes into range, and now as you use your willpower to reach for that less angry thought, that becomes your center range. And now as you reach for this less angry thought, now you're into something that you might not even call angry. It might be mild frustration. And the really angry thought is now out of your range. So little by little by little by little by little, you can bring yourself to a much better feeling place. Now let's talk about it in light of what happens with diagnoses. You've been in this place of not feeling very good for some time maybe, and now you have a manifestation that somebody gives a label to. So all of a sudden, even though you had this range of sometimes worried to really worried sometimes, now they've given it a label, now you're really worried. And as you focus upon that, that becomes your center range. And as more and more and more and more people focus upon it and talk about it, and now that becomes your center range. And so in the same way that you can reach for the better feeling thought and the better feeling thought and the better feeling thought and shift your center to a much better mood and a much better place of attraction, so it can go the other way. In other words, whatever it is you're giving your attention to becomes your center range, which means now you have further and further and further and further and further. And so that's why there are many people who are just not focused. They're bombarded by so many things. The television's got them thinking about thousands of things in an hour. They are reaching out to the four corners of the world, and so there are endless things that they might talk about. You have telephones that you take everywhere with you, and answering machines that never allow you to miss a call. In other words, you are technologically bombarded with thought stimulation that some are not ready to cope with. And when they are given a label of confusion that carries a lot of weight with it, do you see that's why when they say you have a degenerating illness or something that's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and worse, we say, it can get worse and worse and worse, or it can get better and better and better. Everything can become more of what you do not want or more of what you do want. It depends upon where the focus is being applied. There is no disease that perpetuates other than because law of attraction abounds, you see. And so if we were working in the field where we were wanting to soothe something like this, we would be talking about energy. We would be talking about mood. We would be talking about attitude. We would be talking about thought process. We would be talking about what are you thinking about and how are you feeling as you are thinking about it, you see. The very worst thing for someone to do who has been given a diagnosis that is of a mental nature is to get into a group where everybody's talking about that and how bad it is. And the very best thing that could happen is a diversion from that, a focusing upon other things apart from that, you see.
Things that they enjoy doing, just getting out and having fun and recentering.
Jerry would say to his mother when she would call him by his brother's name or by his sister's name, she sort of would call the roll every time. She would say, I'm getting very old. And Jerry would say, you did that 40 years ago. In other words, he was always trying to diffuse. It did not have anything to do with her age. It had to do with her focus. It had to do with what she was thinking about in the moment. It isn't about something that is degenerating. Another soft bridge is we all do that. It's about distraction. Everything is about focus. You can be specifically focused or generally focused. And you cannot be specifically focused on a whole lot of things at once. And when you are specifically focused upon something and someone calls your attention here, and then 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 thinks that there's something wrong with you because you're choosing to hold your focus someplace else, and that's in part what is happening. There are many people that are, and that's what we meant when we began here, that they are withdrawing from the trauma or the overwhelmment of the physical surroundings and fixating on things that feel better. And then those who are clamoring for their attention out